Okay, well, hello everybody. My name is Ashley Hackett. I'm the Washington correspondent for MinnPost, which is a nonprofit independent newsroom serving Minnesota. Today I will be talking with Senator Amy Klobschar about her new book, but first I wanted to thank all of the MinnPost members with us for supporting our nonprofit newsroom and making our reporting free to all readers and events like this one free to attend. If you're not a member, you can be a vital part of our reporting with a donation of any amount at minnpost.com/support. So this afternoon, I'm joined by Senator Amy Klobschar, who joined the Senate in 2006 and now serves on the Senate Judiciary Committee, where she is a chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Competition, Policy, Antitrust, and Consumer Rights. Senator Klobuchar has just published a new book called Antitrust, Taking on Monopoly Power from the Gilded Age. I have it right here. This book outlines her history with and views on the threat of monopoly power. The book is a call for action and attention towards the consequences of concentrations of wealth, power, and control in a smaller and smaller number of corporations. So thanks so much for joining us this evening, Senator Klobuchar, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. But just one thing I wanted to add before we really dig in. We are doing a Q&A portion at the end of this panel. And so if you look down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little notch that says Q&A. So you can click on that and you can enter a question that you'd like the senator to answer. We're asking that today, since this talk is focused more around her book, that it be focused on antitrust, but there will also be applicable themes that we're talking about throughout the interview that you are welcome to ask a question on. So with that, I will get started. Senator Klobuchar, thank you so much for being here. It's nice to have a hometown newsroom talking to our hometown senator. So great to be here.
Thank you, Ashley. And I'm a big fan of MinnPost. My dad briefly, for a few years, wrote a bit for MinnPost. And I think it's just a wonderful news organization to have in Minnesota, and we're very lucky. So that's my first moment to say that. And it's somewhat related to antitrust because we know how hard it is for news organizations right now. So I was like quietly supporting your pitch there. One of the themes of the book is about how we want to keep our news organizations strong. And I'm just really excited to be here. I've worked on this book for about 3 years, both before on breaks from the presidential campaign and most significantly when it ended. Mostly because I've had this, not just front row seat, but in the middle of all this and seeing this incredible consolidation of power in certain industries, particularly pharma, tech, and a number of others, which has been bad for consumers. And if you trace through history, the country has always rallied and used our antitrust laws to push back, to rejuvenate capitalism and small business. And that's what this book is all about. And I try to do it in a fun way, for those of you who've seen it, with over 100 cartoons. Okay, 200 pages of footnotes, but you don't have to read it.
There's a lot of footnotes in this book, a lot of consolidated information, but I did enjoy the cartoon.
5 recommendations of like things we actually could get done. So
right. And yeah, thank you for your support of MinnPost. I know that your dad did do, I think, a weekly sports column for MinnPost, which is pretty cool. And yeah, so very excited to have that connection, and I'm excited to dig into the book as well. So the first thing that I want to talk about, you kind of begin this book writing about how you realized that monopolies were hurting Minnesotans in the early days of Washington Corps. So I think I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that experience and how that hometown Minnesota hospital issue kind of brought antitrust to the forefront for you.
Yeah, so that was a really surprising call to our office. It was a pharmacist, and sometimes you get these calls and you think, really? But it turned out to be true. And then I called the head of Children's Hospital at the time, Alan Goldblum. I talked to him, met with him eventually, and learned what had happened. One drug company had the drug that really fixed a problem called PDA. I won't go into the whole medical piece of it, but it was about newborns born with defective heart valves. And then when they sold that drug to this company called Ovation at the same time acquired the rights to another drug. Guess what? It was the only other drug that fixed this. So they basically cornered the market. And it was at that moment where they took the price and raised it from $85 a treatment, where it had stood for a long, long time, to $1,600 a treatment. And so this was costing families of newborns with severe heart defects and hospitals who were eating the cost if the families couldn't afford it or their insurance didn't cover it, literally millions and millions of dollars across the country. So I asked, new senator, I got all the facts, I wrote the company, they wrote me back, it was about moving expenses. That's a true story. I then asked the FTC about it at the hearing, I held up the vial, and then they started looking into it. They thought it was really bad. They brought a lawsuit along with all these attorney generals who were looking into it as well, including in red states. They bring this case, it goes before a judge who relies on actually some pretty conservative precedent of the courts that's out there right now. She basically rejects it and says, no, I guess it's okay. And then the court upholds that. And I thought at that moment, and it was kind of a controversial legal ruling, I'll tell you that much, but I thought to myself at the time, if a US senator, even a new one, and the FTC and all these attorney generals can't save newborn babies' heart valve drug, then we've got a problem. And the problem is that our antitrust laws haven't been updated for decades, like they used to be all the time when things would go wrong or they needed to, new industry came in and they would put things in place. Number one. Number two, our agencies are a shadow of their former selves. We're asking them to take on the biggest companies in the world, and there's less people that work there than during Ronald Reagan. And so those things, plus just my interest in democracy and the fact that I think that misinformation on tech companies, those kinds of things, even about vaccines, have been driving a lot of divide in this country, and that there's something we can do about it. All of that drove me to write this book. But that original story was reflective of what I later learned. EpiPen, something my daughter depends on. Price inflates when there's a monopoly, basic monopoly, or a duopoly, 1, 2, 3 companies. Insulin. Everyone knows common drug used to almost cost close to nothing when escalates, when there's less companies, when a generic goes off the market, all kinds of things. This is capitalism. It's like the monopoly game. That's where I start out by telling that. When people have bought out a corner of the board, which I used to play a lot growing up, would beat anyone, including my grandma, basically push people out of the marketplace. And we've always in this country been an entrepreneurial place, and we have a check and balance supported by Democrats and Republicans, which is the antitrust laws. And we have fallen woefully behind in how we enforce them, how we update them, and how they are interpreted by the courts, leading to this heyday of basically a new generation of the Gilded Age.
Yeah, and I believe you touched on a lot of the topics that we're going to get into that I have planned, at least for us in this panel. But before we even get into all of the current day things, I wanted to touch on a little bit of Minnesota history that you wrote about in this book with the Grange movement. And so I'm wondering if you might be able to talk about that aspect of the book and kind of the history of antitrust laws before we get into the modern day stuff.
Well, thanks for being the first person to ask about that. And because I keep on this after an interview, I go, why did I mention this? Because the Minnesota piece of it, and in general, the Midwest is prominent in this. And it's one of my arguments that the Midwest has to stand up. It used to be kind of the Midwest against some of the, and there still is, consolidation in finance and the like. And Morgan, remember the whole JP Morgan and the history there. But now it's a lot of some of the consolidation in Silicon Valley, but the Midwest has to stand up. So the history is that the first case ever brought successfully before the Supreme Court involved a Minnesotan, James J. Hill. And he actually was one of the people, one of the robber barons who originally started making these trusts, where basically companies who used to compete against each other at that point for rail would form a trust, and they would work through that. And so, as we all know, Teddy Roosevelt, right, the ultimate trust-busting president, by the way, along with a number of other presidents who followed him, two others, they became pretty obsessed with this. And politically, he was obsessed with it because the people were obsessed with it, because of grain prices, because of how expensive it was to use rail, how expensive steel was. And that was the case that was the first successful antitrust break. The court ruled to break up that trust. Second example, as you mentioned, the Grangers, the Midwesterners and our farmers were the first to push state laws on antitrust, which ultimately ended up with a Midwesterner, John Sherman, who is a Republican senator from Ohio, leading the nation's first antitrust law in Washington. But before that, Iowa was the first state to do a comprehensive antitrust law, and many started. Much of the political movement behind those laws came from Minnesota. If anyone remembers that Oliver Kelly Hudson farm, that farm, and maybe someone can write on the chat line if I got that exactly right, but that farm, that Oliver Kelly farm, that farm was actually the guy who started it was born on the East Coast. He came to Minnesota and he started this movement of farmers because it was so tough for them at the time because the monopolists were making it really hard for them to make a living. So that was going on in the Midwest. The union movement, those strikes were going on against trusts everywhere, but the pinnacle of it was in Chicago with the Haymarket massacres, it was called, because people died during what was once a peaceful march and then turned into riots, as well as the Pullman strike against the Pullman Rail Company. One weird but incredibly moving story related to this was Melvin Carter's story. His grandpa was actually a porter on the Pullman lines, and they would always hire African-American porters, and everyone would call them George. Wasn't his grandpa's name, but they'd always call them George. People on the train, because it was easier for them to call the African-American porters George. And so when Melvin testified, when I had him testify after the murder of George Floyd before the Judiciary Committee, he told that story, and he talked about George Floyd and told how we all are all George. Well, that goes back to one of the biggest monopolies of the time, of course, the Pullman Company. So all of this was happening in the Midwest, and as a result, it was very difficult to be a Democrat or a Republican and in the hands of monopolies. Now, that wasn't saying that for 100 years prior to that, it was real bad. The monopolist controls court rulings. Even after the Sherman Act passed, for 10 years, nothing happened because the court was ruling against workers and against small business in favor of monopolists. But eventually, this really caught on, and that got to the heyday of enforcement, which of course included things like the breakup of AT&T and the like. So that was it was fun to learn all that Minnesota history as I wrote this, and the pivotal role that we played, along with many other Midwesterners like William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska, in this saga of antitrust.
Yeah, thank you for giving us that rundown. And I'm happy to be the first person to ask about that Minnesota history. I think it's interesting. And, I have some dairy farmers in my family too. I grew up in Minnesota, so it's always cool to hear that history going back with these big movements. So we have the history of monopolies and antitrust movements. We have the issue at Children's Hospital that you spoke about earlier. And now we have everything else. So we're going to get into everything else now. And so one of the things I want to ask about in one of your later chapters in the book, you outlined 12 challenges that Americans face when it comes to antitrust. But I want to focus right now, at least on one of those, which was the power of big tech as it relates to all of this. And so big tech has had some really interesting developments recently, particularly with tech giants like Facebook. And so I know that you've had some interactions, or at least some words to say with Mark Zuckerberg. And it seems like he said that he would rather just buy out a lot of the other smaller tech companies around him instead of competing.
He said it in an email that they discovered in the House hearings, but yes.
Right. And so I'm wondering if you could speak on that a little bit. I know there's been a lot going on in your subcommittees in the Judiciary Committee. But I'm wondering, as of right now, what are we looking at when we're thinking about tech giants like Facebook, who their goal is to kind of buy out the competition?
Yeah, so as I went through this history, we're now at this point in our economy where we have this whole new group of monopolies. I mentioned pharma, everything from cat food to caskets. I can talk about those things later, but in tech, it really is somewhat unique because you've got gatekeepers, right? So I'll use a few examples. Google, probably one of the best examples, 90% of the search market, controlling the ads. At the same time, they're getting information about the customers and using that in their algorithms. And they literally, Google and Facebook, told an entire nation, the country of Australia, that they were going to just pick up and leave if they charge it for their content or force them to pay a certain amount for their content. Now, the world objected. It wasn't just Australia that did, and they backed away from that. But that gives you a sense of if they had left, Microsoft stood up, which was great, and said, hey, you can use us. But the issue is that Google had 90% of the search market. So they felt that they had the clout to do that. You look at Amazon when it comes to ordering online. You look at the Apple stores, the app stores, and Google stores depending on the kind of phone. We had a hearing on this a few weeks ago and learned some things that Mike Lee, who's a conservative Republican, he and I did this hearing together every step of the way, including calling the witnesses. We couldn't believe what we learned. Spotify, Tile, and Match.com were willing to come forward. He and I both knew so many other companies are going to us and saying, oh my God, this is a disaster that's so anti-competitive, but we're afraid to say anything because they'll screw us on the Google search. True story, because they're monopolies. So what happens instead is these companies do say, we'll come forward, these three, and they tell the horror stories of how they have to pay up to 30% anything you buy if you go through the App Store. They can't on the App Store tell anyone that you can get a cheaper rate on their website. And then they can do things, and we believe they do things like self-preferencing. So why does Spotify have to pay 30% and Uber doesn't? There's Apple Music. And so these are classic antitrust problems, and it's why Europe just finished a major investigation of this and is taking action. It's why lawsuits are going on right now. So that's why when I look at all this, I think, okay, there's a lot of different remedies, which I lay out in my book. One, privacy. They have no incentives right now, except for public pushback, to put the kind of bells and whistles in place for privacy. Why? Well, they don't have a competitor. Facebook doesn't really have a competitor of their ilk. And every time there's close to one, as you point out, they bought them out. Instagram, WhatsApp. It was a second email that they discovered from Mark Zuckerberg where he literally said, and these are his words, these businesses are nascent, but the network's established. The brands are already meaningful. And if they grow to a large scale, they could be very disruptive to us. That's what you're supposed to do. Tech is supposed to disrupt things. He is showing, this is Exhibit A, that they bought them because they didn't want the market disruption to them. And so perhaps they would have developed better policies and better options on misinformation. Perhaps Instagram and WhatsApp would have done more on privacy. We will never know because they were bought out. And so literally for those ideas and those things that we want, even beyond price, it is really important that we have competition. So the government can put rules into place, they should, on privacy. But the reason you want to use antitrust for that stuff is you want to allow the marketplace to do it. Just like when AT&T was broken up, we got what? A really incredible cell phone options that we didn't have before. We got lower long distance prices. It will be different with divesting assets from, say, Facebook or Google, but we will get something out of it as consumers. So one remedy is divesting assets. Another remedy is putting in place conditions to say you can't self-preference yourself and make your products do better than the other products. And I know that a good and strong investigation is going to find all kinds of stuff that's going on in this area. So those are things that the Justice Department or the FTC can do to protect consumers. And I figure our role is to fund them so they can do it, so they're not a shadow of their former selves and they're not using Band-Aid and duct tape, and that they can, that we have laws that make it easier for them to do this. And that the Biden administration puts in some key people in important roles so they aggressively take this on.
And so if we're thinking about trying to, for people who haven't read the book, first of all, because it recently came out, and we're thinking about how to make monopolies and antitrust law feel more applicable. So if we can look at the tech companies, say like you were just talking about, and think that there may be fewer privacy risks to us, right? If there is not a monopoly held by a company such as Google, and so privacy is one thing that we can look forward to if we're able, if this legislation is able to go through. What are some?
We will also need federal rules on privacy, honestly, because it's gotten so out of hand. States are starting to do it. It's about knowingly opting in to have your data shared, so you don't have it shared because you can't figure out the rules. That's a bad situation. It's about knowledge about breaches right away. Maybe it's about taxing them when they start using people's data so the money can go back to the people. It's all kinds of things to stop some of the behavior, so that you send an email about, your mom sends you an email about ceiling fans and suddenly you start having all these ceiling fan advertisements, and I think you know why. Okay, keep going.
Right. Yeah, I feel like, every conversation I have, I'll suddenly see a targeted ad on Facebook or Instagram or whatever I'm using on my Google ads, and it seems to appear there. And I think like a lot of people are wondering where that's coming from. So, so privacy, right, is one thing. Another big aspect that I think about when I think about monopolies and the dangers that they might pose to consumers and to citizens has to do with healthcare. And so I have kind of a two-pronged question for you relating to the pandemic. So we can start with the first part. We had a global pandemic. Things were already bad before that. It often exacerbated issues in almost every sector of the economy and in social life. But I'm wondering if there are concrete ways that we can look at how the pandemic may have worsened situations as it relates to antitrust.
Mm-hmm. First way is kind of obvious. We lost a bunch of small businesses that couldn't survive this. I'm proud of what we did with the America Rescue Plan under Joe Biden's leadership, but also before that, the bipartisan agreements we negotiated through last year. We basically stopped a complete economic earthquake from tearing apart this country. But that didn't mean that there wasn't a lot of roadkill out there, and a lot of small businesses that are still closed down. And that's not good, because it's hard enough to start a small business, much less sustain it during a pandemic. And that can lead, and I think you will see more and more sales of businesses that can't make it in today's economy, and they keep, buying them up, and then you have less competition. Really hard for women-owned, minority-owned businesses to get us keep going. They maybe can start up, right? Especially even during a pandemic, people can start their own operation somewhat easily, but then can they really sustain it when a monopoly has that much power? So that's one way the pandemic has made this harder. The second thing is, of course, we've all relied and are thankful for technology. And I do want to say this, I'm not like, as Mike Lee called himself at our last hearing, as he was trying to figure out why Uber didn't have to pay these fees and Spotify did, and Match.com, and he was honestly struggling, as I was, with, okay, excuse me, you have to pay these fees if you want to go meet someone on a date. You have to pay extra to Apple or Google, but you don't if you want to order a car. It really doesn't quite make sense. And so He called himself a caveman. So I am not a cave, for a joke. He said, I'm not a caveman here. I am not a cavewoman when it comes to tech. I use all these things. I'm wearing a Fitbit. I still think that you can do something about regulating that data and making sure that you own the data. That's why I have a bipartisan bill on it. And I think that it is on us right now to say, it's great, we use these products even bigger time during the pandemic, but that doesn't mean we just stop there. If we had that attitude during AT&T, we would have thought, okay, hey, Ma Bell's great. They gave us the, different kinds of phones, bright aqua ones, this and that with big cords on them. Yay, we're so happy with that. Yeah, they gave us some great things. But then over time, we wanted more competition and we wanted to take care of things that weren't right and that we could do better. And that's exactly what should be happening right now with tech. We shouldn't just rest on our laurels. And we certainly don't want to become China with only one big company that is allowed to run rampant in all these major areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking also on the grounds of the pandemic being the health crisis that it is, I know we touched on the danger of monopolies in the healthcare field earlier, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more on what we're looking at with medications and what we might be looking at in the future if things go on as they are currently.
And our subcommittee, by the way, is going to have hearings on this, on healthcare consolidation across the board, including a major focus on pharma. This was actually going on before the pandemic. With hospitals, it was certainly going on with pharmaceuticals. There used to be a lot of competition in that area. And what I find interesting, the public is still incredibly mad that we don't have, for instance, negotiation for prices under Medicare. I lead that bill in the Senate. Yes, we're happy that a bunch of companies develop vaccines. That's great. And we thank them every day for that. But that doesn't mean we say, okay, we trust you to do whatever you want and you just go ahead. No, we should have negotiation for prices under Medicare. The nation's seniors are a pretty big group and they're pretty good at getting deals. They should be allowed through the government to negotiate better deals. We should have a of safe drugs from safe countries like Canada. That would create pressure. We should make it easier to get generics out there. That's a bill we passed part of it. We need to do more. And then we need to start looking at the industry as a whole, more carefully scrutinize mergers, which is true in all of these areas, no matter what the industry is. And I suggest some different standards to make it easier to do that. We would have to pass them, Congress would. And then we should also look back at certain industries and see if there's things that can be done. That's what happened with Standard Oil when another hands off to journalism after Ida Tarbell, a pioneering muckraker, which was the name for investigative journalists at the time, took on Standard Oil and wrote this big book. And, maybe her name is not, she's not the one up there on Mount Rushmore and things, but she played a major role in moving our country forward when it came to taking on monopoly power.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that struck me about this book, and these are your words, not mine also, so I'll quote, that the topic of antitrust can be, quote, dull and boring, unquote, at times. And I think, this interview to me at least is not dull or boring, but I think you were trying to make a point there, right, where it's not as sexy a topic as some other things that we see going through Congress. But you also say that the failure to pay attention to this and the failure to reform antitrust laws is hurting Americans. And so my question, and I think, something that our viewers might be wondering too, is this all up to Congress and lawmakers to change, or are there some steps that citizens can take to mitigate the threat of monopolies?
Yeah, I think one of the things, there are many, and I have them all laid out as a map, a roadmap at the end of the book, right. Dividing it into things Congress can do, things the administration can do, and things you can do. And I think before I get to that, the boring part of it, one of the things that's ironic about this is that over time, it used to be there were campaign songs called Bust a Trust. Woodrow Wilson had one. They were literally competing with each other on bringing the public with them when it came to breaking up monopolies. And the last 100 years, and I have one big chapter on it, have become much more about legal arguments and this thing called the University of Chicago School versus the Harvard School about how you interpret antitrust laws. That's all fine, but as it has happened, it's been to the benefit of monopolists. The Bork theories in court have ruled, which are not consistent to where the public is, and aren't even consistent with the intent of those that pass the laws, ironically again. And so we've taken it out of the public realm. And so my quest with this book is to bring it back to the public realm. And things that you can do, that people can do out there, is to, besides reading my book, is to, number one, contact your representatives. We always say that. And by the way, states can do things. It's not just the federal government. Keith Ellison has been a major leader on antitrust when he was in Congress and now. But call people, call members of Congress, Democrats or Republicans, and ask them to support these bills and tell them that that you want to see something done. Find out about the groups, and I list them in my book, a number of the ones that are involved. Get on their lists for email alerts and the like. Open Markets is one example, but there's many other great sources you can go to for updated information about antitrust. Shop local. Do your own research. You're going to find out if you think you're cool going on online travel. Of course, you should keep doing it, but have your eyes wide open. 90% of those online travel sites like Kayak, Expedia are owned by only 2 companies. You think you're getting all these deals. In the words of John Oliver, after a half-an-hour segment looking at all the consolidation, he said, if this is enough that makes you want to die, good luck, because there's only 3 casket makers left in America. And I pointed out that no, actually one bought the other, so there's only 2. So, educate yourself, as I know Majors and Quinn customers do all the time, and MinnPost viewers, keep doing it. It's worth it because you will become the expert on this with even a minimal amount of knowledge. You will become the expert on it to talk to your friends and family. And so I lay out all those things that you can do, because honestly, one of the reasons I wrote the book is I cannot do this alone. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. I cannot tell you how hard it is, because every time you're almost done and you get something done on antitrust, Senator Grassley and I trying to change the fee structure and saying, after years and decades, why don't we charge the big mergers that we never even knew possible, billion-dollar, trillion-dollar companies, why don't we charge them a little more? It's a drop in the bucket. Then we put that money, not taxpayer money, we put that money into the FTC and antitrust DOJ. At the end of the year, I had that through the Senate as part of the end of the year budget deal with his help. I had it past the White House. Mark Meadows, the President Trump's chief of staff, was supporting it, but I got stopped by Kevin McCarthy and Jim Jordan in the House. Now we're having it on the Judiciary Committee agenda for the coming week after next. And I think I'm going to finally make it through, but literally there are interests everywhere that stop every single thing I've tried to do. So the only way is to be transparent, to open this up, to get the public interested. And the fact that we finally have Democrats and Republicans that are focused on this, I have to use this moment to my advantage.
Right, the time seems to be right for pushing things like that forward. And speaking of legislation that's moving through Congress right now, I know that you have a lot of eggs in the basket right now. I'm thinking partially about the For the People Act, which could really reform campaign finance and do a lot of other things as it relates to voting in America. But I'm just wondering, from a lawmaking standpoint, what do you prioritize here? Are you just constantly working on everything at once? Is it For the People Act, antitrust, like everything all at once? Or do you say, okay, we're going to get this through and then we can get to antitrust? Or how does that work for you? How do you play that out?
Well, there's some burning issues when you're in charge, and I'm in charge of the Senate Rules Committee. So I have primary responsibility to at least getting the For the People to the floor, which I can explain. It's actually very related to antitrust. And I'm also in charge of the investigation of the Capitol, along with Senator Peters, Portman, and Blunt. It's like a bipartisan investigation, which we are going to be coming out with that report in May. And so there are things, and the antitrust, I'm in charge of that subcommittee. But of course, I think President Biden's State of the Union pretty much laid it out. My number one goal is getting through this pandemic, getting the vaccines to people, saving lives, shoring up our economy. And then you go through all these these major things we need to do on climate change and immigration reform and police reform. These are things that I've been working on for years. But that being said, if we don't do something about our campaign finance system and make it easier for people to vote, it's going to be really hard in the long term to make change that's consistent with where the public is. And I think antitrust is a great example of that. It's just been hidden away, and every time you try to do something, some big interest, goes in there, and there's an old cartoon of the big trust, steel trust at the time, oil trust, looming over these big blobs like balloons that say steel trust, looming over the Senate, basically pulling the strings as they vote. That's how it feels sometimes. And the For the People Act would really fix a lot of that. And it's very difficult because there's no Republican support for it right now, as we see with the voter suppression. But we have the ability to get the bill to the floor, even with what I anticipate to be an even vote. Remember, the Senate's still 50-50, as you well know from covering it, Ashley. So that's most likely the best I can get, but that will allow Senator Schumer, under the rules, to bring the bill to the floor. And so that's what this hearing is coming up. But we'll try our best. We're going to put in a bunch of, really good amendments that get at some of the concerns people have raised and things like that. And, we'll see what they do. I mean, if they want to negotiate, that would be a great moment. But I've got an obligation to the public to move ahead.
Right. And I want to give time for our Q&A, but I am curious if you could briefly go into how reforming campaign finance would play into would be connected to antitrust. How does that work in your head?
So the two major things in the bill is public finance, like we have in Minnesota, which I think has actually worked well. But the second part is something called the Disclose Act that we've been pushing for a long time. Senator Franken had worked on this as well. This is about trying to make sure that you know where the money's coming from, especially the dark money that lurks behind the surface. So when you look at antitrust, it's like, duh, because a lot of these big interests have a lot of sway over members. So the more you can have sunshine on this and show where the money's coming from directly on antitrust lobbying efforts, the tech companies, just look it up right now. I always believe in trying to be accurate, so I don't know the exact number, but they have spent millions and millions and millions, some of the biggest amounts in Washington, on stopping and starting legislation. And so that alone, shedding a light on that, giving less credibility to big interests when they are spending money, would be a major game changer when it comes to antitrust reform and trying to get things done. When you look back in history, there was all kinds of graft with politicians, bad stuff going on. But what happened was that the political movement was so strong for regular people that finally that punctured all of the graft and corruption that was going on with the politicians. And this is a different type of basically shenanigans and people not really acting until they have to and they're called on it. I've got to get us to a point where people have to act on this.
Okay. Lots of shenanigans happening out there, it seems. All right. Well, I can see that we have a ton of cues in the Q&A section, so I'm going to move to that so we can get some smart questions from our viewers. So I will go with the first one on my list. So from Kimberly Broadwater, she asks, for the absolute novice like me, in parentheses, why has antitrust been sent to the back burner for decades when those that do understand the importance of it stood by?
I think, as I mentioned, Kim, so much of this has been in the purview of courts, and that's fine. You want to have lawsuits go on, and it might be fine if they were interpreting the laws as they used to be interpreted. It sounds like I'm an originalist or something, but really when you look back to original court decisions, they were, after about a period of 10 years, they were much more focused after the Sherman Act passed, eventually on the consumers and how they were hurt by mergers. Then this other movement called the Bork movement and the Chicago School, that's where I went for law school, arose, which basically interpreted the laws in a different way. And that's what's governed, and certainly what's governed the decisions of justices like Justice Gorsuch. So you can't just wait, and it's been in the backwater because all these cases have been sitting in court, and we realized, no, you can't just do that. You've got to do something else. And so I think there are things you can do. do under existing law, but we need the political will to do it. And so that's why I am really pleased that, for instance, when you talk about, Kim talks about it being in the backwaters, getting it out of the backwaters. People like Lena Khan, who President Biden nominated for the FTC, who wrote this really groundbreaking law review article. I know it sounds weird that you have a viral law review article, but she did on Amazon. Or you have Tim Wu, who's wrote a book called The Curse of Bigness, which is Justice Brandeis's words as he looked at monopolies. He's now installed in the White House. I've talked to him many, many times. So having out-of-the-box thinkers who I think can appeal actually to a new generation as well when it comes to talking about antitrust and competition policy and what this means is going to be really important to taking it out of where it has existed for decades, where you have an occasional mention on the on the show Billions. I've actually tried to document every time antitrust was discussed, including an effort by Comedy Central to find funny antitrust stories. Where I think it was Jon Stewart was a host at the time, went back and looked at when the Madison Tavern owners in our neighboring state of Wisconsin tried to put some limits on happy hours and when you could shut things down. And an enterprising student decided to sue and say that they were colluding in violation of the antitrust laws. Now that was thrown out because it was said it was for public safety, but they kept trying to find some humor in this story. And so I've really tried to find these modern day references in a big way. And I finally decided, well, I'll have to write my own 600-page book so that people can see these stories. But I think things are changing. They are. Or Joe Biden would have put people in like Lena Khan and Tim Wu, and you wouldn't have bipartisan legislation for the first time. Actually, you wouldn't have had the House investigation that went on all last year, conducted by my friend David Cicilline. All these things are exciting if you want to do something about antitrust.
All right, thanks for that answer. I will go to our next question. From Pat Widener, why can't we get cheaper drugs from Canada?
Oh, Pat, man, tell that to everyone in Congress. So I did that bill with Grassley, and I used to, and Grassley's a bit of a maverick when it comes to these competition issues. That's why I keep mentioning his name. I gave him a signed copy of my book and mentioned all the pages that he was on. John McCain did that bill with me, and I miss him every single day before. And we had a pretty good vote in the Senate where we had a number of Republicans vote with us. So we need to just call this thing up. And I have tried to do this many times, but it is about allowing some competition from safe countries. Bernie and I have worked on this together extensively. He's a big fan of this, to come in and compete against the big guys. And when you look at what's been against us, it is truly the power of pharma, which goes to the relevance of your question on the For the People Act, Ashley, just because that pharma has so much power and have exercised that power really on both sides of the aisle. And there's a number of us who've been out front saying enough is enough. And so I think that we need to get this done. I am tired of talking about it. I just think we need to do it. I saw myself when we had drug shortages. Susan Collins and I joined forces with Bob Casey, and we said, okay, let's do a better job of getting drugs from other countries that are safe when we have drug shortages for kids' cancer drugs. And we passed that, and we've had some problems. Don't get me wrong, with all these problems with pharma, it hasn't solved everything, but it did make some improvements. And when I saw they could do that when it came to actual drug shortages, I thought, wait a minute, if they can do that for that, why can't we do that for price crises, right? When insulin goes way up or EpiPen goes way up. And we know that in Canada, the prices of the drugs are whatever it is, depending on the year, 4 times cheaper, 10 times cheaper. And so this is our moment to move on this. And I hope Joe Biden does. I was very pleased in the State of the Union and know firsthand he personally felt strongly he should bring up the negotiation of prices under Medicare. And I thought that was important.
Yeah, well, I will stick on the Medicare and the healthcare track. So from Mary Kosowski, I've heard that the vaccine developers received huge amounts of taxpayer dollars to help them get the vaccines going. And now they're making huge profits off of vaccines, and they're not sharing the formulas with other countries, which could manufacture them if they only had the recipes. And of course, they desperately need the vaccines because millions of people are dying. Why not make those tax dollars loans instead of gifts? Why not force any IP generated from tax dollars to be shared?
Well, I think one thing we know is that when the research was done, there was agreements among the world, not just the U.S. Pharmaceuticals, to share research, and scientists, right? We're sharing the research, which aided everyone in developing the vaccine quicker. That was really, really important, something they normally don't do. I would have to look at all the details. As we know, a lot of this was negotiated during the Trump administration about the money they were given to quickly develop, which many of us felt was really important. Speed meant everything, as we were losing lives every day. But whether we can convert that, what we can do now to push the sharing of the information they have, which is a good question, and how right now it's a bit of a production issue, as everyone knows, because our country just pledged $100 million in help in general for equipment and everything else, as well as vaccines to India. We are starting, because of the work that was done by scientists, because of the work that's been done to improve our distribution, we're going to be in a position where our big fights are going to be with vaccines. And why I wanted to bring up the farmer price thing. Number one, that we fight this misinformation, which is again directly related to antitrust because of the fact that there are not good ways to get rid of misinformation, because 12 accounts, according to a recent study, literally were responsible for 60-some% of the misinformation out there, and it took two senators, one of them was me, to write a letter to push the companies to take down some of these accounts. We have the second big challenge we have after the misinformation and the hesitancy is really the rest of the world. We don't live on an island here. And as was pointed out by the question, as you've seen these rising rates in other parts of the world, it is in our best interest, not just as a humanitarian cause, which of course is first and foremost, but for our own health and safety to get that vaccine out. And we're doing it now with aid and pushing it out, and soon we'll be able to do even more. But that's why whatever we can do, and gets to the writer's question, to make it easier for these companies to make it easier for these countries to get the vaccines, the better. So I'll look into all that, and I appreciate the question.
Excellent. Let's see, from Janice Hoff or Janice Hugh. I'm sorry if one of those is hopefully right. So Janice asks, one industry with bipartisan consumer frustration is the airlines. And we have so many fewer choices already. Will your legislation try to keep some of the big 3 or 4 airlines from buying others or each other?
Well, I've actually taken on some of this in the past in my role on the subcommittee, or even before I chaired it up as the member of the Judiciary Committee. And what my legislation, what's somewhat unique about it is this isn't just about tech. There's a lot of people just talking about tech. I get it, but I think we need to look industry-wide. And one of the ways you do that is by really 2 big things that would help with airlines as well. You make it harder to get mergers approved if they hurt competition, not just generally. No one wants to, hurt anyone from exercising their right to buy companies and merge. But under my suggestions is, if you are, in the legislation I put together, if you are bigger than $5 billion and you're engaging in a major merger, that you should have to prove that it doesn't hurt competition. The company should, instead of the government doing it. The other thing that I do is to change the standard to literally just make it easier. So if it materially affects competition in some way, that's a trigger for a problem. So that's the one thing. The second thing, which is really key in any industry, including airlines, is looking backwards. And maybe things were okay for a while, and then you get to the point where you're saying, wait a minute, we let Facebook by Instagram, and now there's really no competitors of their size left anymore. Maybe we need to look back and allow for divesting assets, or maybe an aggressive Justice Department, even by starting an investigation, will often lead to different companies that will agree to different terms, even without bringing a lawsuit or getting that lawsuit to culmination. And then finally, we don't even collect industry consolidation information. At one point, I was using stats from 2012. The FTC, Federal Trade Commission, used to collect all that. Even Casper Weinberger thought that was a good thing to do back then when he was there. They stopped doing it, and so it's really hard to look industry-wide, including at airlines, and they have arguments about international competition and the like to make that case. So that's something else I would suggest we do. And then people shouldn't forget that there's also other kinds of regulations about pilots sleeping and about how much room you have in a seat even. There's rules that we put in place over the years to get at some of the problems in airlines and in other industries.
Got it. I think, let's see, we may have time for about one more question.
Okay.
So I'm going to go with one from Thomas Hawk. Mm-hmm. And Tom asks, where, if any, is the best place to find common ground on antitrust for Republicans and Democrats in order to see some legislative change?
I know Tom Hawk. I know he believes in that very much. And I think that the best way is to find, I can't say what it's going to be. I can just base it on my conversations with my colleagues. So, let me start with that bill I just brought up with Grassley. On that one, despite us getting some objections, as I noted, from some Republicans, Grassley's been true on this. He's stood with me. We're bringing it up. There are a number of Republicans who are going to stand with me on that bill, and I've done that over time by talking to them quietly on the Senate floor, and that's going to add over $130 million to these agencies, which is going to make it a lot easier for them to, if they just did those tech cases, which we want them to do, Facebook and Google, at least I do, well, then they've got to do all this other stuff we've been talking about too. So you want to make sure they have the resources. Here's another great example with MinnPost, one of the sponsors, newspapers, news organizations. That is a bipartisan effort by Senator Kennedy of Louisiana and myself, as well as Representative Buck, a Republican in the House, and Representative Cicilline, that says that the news organizations can stand together and negotiate together to their content rates with the tech companies. That's an exception to the antitrust laws. It's necessitated by the fact that a little newspaper in Lanesboro or in, you name your town across the nation, isn't necessarily going to be able to negotiate those rates themselves. And so that's why we've joined together. That's an example of a bipartisan bill. I have so many Republicans talking to me right now on pieces of my bill, and I am very happy to not be a monopolist. I am very happy to say it's not just my way or the highway, and it's not just one idea, and hey, let's break up my bill. I'm fine with that. As long as what we're passing makes a difference, and it's not just lip service or another study. There's areas we might want to have studies in, like cross ownership, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But it is really taking, in answer to Tom's questions, these things and figuring out what's the biggest thing we can do to make a difference. And there's some tech stuff we can do that's very big, I think, where we will get support. And then getting it passed and finding vehicles. It's just like every other area. But I have really tried hard. That App Store hearing we had was phenomenal. For anyone that really wants a late night watch, find it on the Judiciary Committee website or somewhere at a website near yours. I think it's on our website. But the idea is to look at these things from the lens of a good citizen and figure out what do we think works, and watch how in that hearing, Mike Lee and I showed respect to everyone. They all asked our questions. No one went off really in my mind on that much. They were just simply appalled by the fact that we learned that Google had called one of the witnesses and threatened them the night before by saying, when you testify tomorrow, when your company, they didn't directly call the witness, they called someone at the company at Match.com. Can you imagine calling Match.com? testify. I mean, everyone was appalled, Democrats and Republicans. So my point of that story, Tom, is that there is growing concern about what's going on. If you come at it from a pure capitalist standpoint, Adam Smith standpoint, about fearing the standing army of monopolies and wanting small businesses to thrive, you've got to be concerned. If you come at it because you believe in democracy and you hate the way the internet's been taken over by extremes, and that's fed vaccine misinformation and led to an insurrection, well then sign up with us to try to do something about it. If you come at it because you want better wages and you're tired of income inequality, and you know that as this same point that we've seen this increase in consolidation, we've seen an increase in income inequality, sign up to do something about this. If you're a women-owned, minority-owned business and you want to start in a really hard market, and you all of a sudden you realize, oh, wait a minute, there's only 2 companies that do this and I can only get to a certain point, join with us. That's where I think you've seen so many people take this on from different perspectives, and I think it's really exciting. So we're taking everyone in that wants to do sensible policy changes. So thanks for the question, Tom.
All right. Well, with that, we are going to wrap things up. So I just want to say thank you to you, Senator Klobschar. It's been a delight to talk to you about your new book and about antitrust and a lot of other topics that that relate to all of that. And just to remind everyone that you can read a lot of coverage on similar topics from MinnPost at MinnPost.com. And then one other thing I want to make sure that everyone's aware of before we sign off, we have the DC memo at MinnPost, which is actually my free weekly newsletter that talks about the latest things that are happening with Minnesota's congressional delegation and basically everything that's going on in DC as it may pertain to Minnesota. So you can sign up for the DC memo or any of MinnPost newsletters. All of them are free at minnpost.com/newsletters.
Well, thanks, Ashley, and thanks to Major and Quinn and MinnPost as well. This was a great conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. And thank you to everyone for all of your great questions. Have a good night.
Thanks.